do you think that with us having a new government, um, are you quite positive that the politicians are actually going to start actively addressing the issues and the obstacles that the system has essentially built in for the younger people to start families?
Well, I think you raised three really interesting points, and I'll touch on all of them. The first is how come there's this negative correlation that as we get richer as societies, we have fewer children. The second thing is what about distribution of wealth? And the third thing is what are the politicians doing? So let me start with the first one. I think you raised a very good point. I talk about the geographical and historical paradox. The geographical paradox is that the poorer countries still have, of course, there are poor countries with very low fertility. I said like Jamaica, but still the highest fertility is in the poorest countries. So that correlation between national wealth and low fertility has broken down somewhat since the 70s, but it's still there geographically, still there to some extent. And historically, we all know that our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, if you go back in history, they had a lot less than we had materially, and they had bigger families. So there is that historical and geographical paradox that as we get richer, or where people are richer, they have smaller families. So is the answer then about, well, it's very nice to say you're wealthy societies, what you're suggesting, but where is the wealth? So it's a little bit about equality, particularly intergenerational equality. So Britain has got a lot of wealth, but it's not in the hands of those who would like to have children. And I think that's true to an extent. The trouble is even more equal societies and societies without lots of boomer wealth, societies which are more egalitarian, are now getting to very low fertility rates. I mean, Japan has traditionally been seen as a more or less egalitarian society compared to America, say, whereas America's traditionally had the high end of the developed world fertility, and Japan the low end. The Scandinavian countries were at the higher end, and they're sort of classically more egalitarian, but they're getting very low fertility rates now. So I think it is also to do with priorities. It's to do with how societies wish to spend their wealth. It's a lot to do with expectations. I think young people have got certain expectations of what a lifestyle should be like, where they'd like to live, what their career ambitions are. And I'm not criticizing any of those things. I'm just saying where does childbearing and family formation come in that? And then last, when we come on to politicians, you won't be surprised to hear me say that I have absolutely no faith in this government beginning to address the question. I had no faith in the last government beginning to address the question. But actually, I have less faith in this government. So no government in Britain in more than 50 years of below replacement fertility has ever had anything to say on the subject. Unlike, say, France, where Macron talks about, whether it's effective or not, Macron talks about a demographic crusade. So our politicians are not interested, not listening. It's a long-term problem. But what makes me more pessimistic about this government is that where people were picking up this stuff, it was on the right. So if I think of the politicians that I know and have spoken to about this issue, Miriam Cates, David Frost, Neil O'Brien, they're all on the right. And, I happen to be politically on the right. I'm not ashamed to say that. But I do want to say to people on the left, this shouldn't be a party political issue. And I'm delighted, actually. I do a lot of podcasts with people you'd see are sort of on the right, but I'm looking forward very much to doing one with Novara Media. I'm not quite sure how that will go. I'm very much looking forward to their, I really take my hat off to Aaron Bastani, who is taking an interest in this stuff. But a lot of people on the left don't want to know that there's a long tradition of left-wing pronatalism, that a socialist society would need a young generation just as a capitalist one would. And things I've talked about 100 times, the Marxist critique of Malthusianism, and communist countries in practice have often been very pronatal. So it seems like a kind of anti-natalist attitude exists in some places on the left. I'm not saying Keir Starmer's anti-natalist. And where there is an audience and an appetite for the sorts of things I'm saying, it's more on the right. But even on the right, it's on the fringes of the right. It's not made it into the political discourse as far as the leading politicians and people who really wield power are concerned. So in Britain, at least, this is still a kind of rude topic that is not you don't discuss in polite company. And again, I don't want to generalize. So people in the right wing alternative media, if you want to call it, are really interested in this stuff, and that's great. But I've got plenty of exposure on the BBC, and there are people at the core of the BBC like Amal Rajan. Again, I really take my hat off to him. He's Mr. BBC these days. He's on the Today programme, and he's doing University Challenge, and he's seen as one of the bright, from my perspective, young talents of the BBC, and he is very, very talented, and he's really interested in this stuff. So there's Rosie Duffield in the Labour Party. There are people who are not, and I don't know what Amal Rajan's politics is, and but he's mainstream in the BBC. So there are people who are just on the right, the alternative right, who are talking about this, but they're fewer and further between than people on the right. And so, I've got fantastic exposure to the BBC, and I'm really delighted about that, but I'm still asked on GB News more often than I am on the BBC. So at the moment, there's more interest in the subject on the right, but not enough. And on the left, there's very little. And I would be amazed. I would be astonished if in the next 5 years of Labour government, assuming it is 5 years, any politician of any prominence ever discusses this topic.
Too radioactive for them, I think. That the
really
Overton window of what is being discussed by our politicians is miles out of touch with what's actually going on and what everyone can see with their own eyes if you happen to be living in the UK.
I'm not trying to shift the Overton window on this. I'm trying to open it, because at the moment there is no Overton window. It's completely shut. So let's just get it open a crack, please. That's what I'm trying to do. And I very much appreciate the work of people like you and other Substackers like Matt Goodwin, and people who are getting this